Welcome, friends, to an epic journey through time, a voyage across the waters of destiny. Today, we set sail with one of history's most legendary figures, Alexander the Great. This is not just a story of battles and kings. It is the tale of a young man, barely in his 20s, who dared to unite Greece, challenge the mighty Persian Empire, and march into the unknown. In the spring of Sandrisus BC, Alexander stood at the shores of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia, and saw not just a stretch of water, but the threshold to immortality. Over the coming chapters, we will follow him step by step, through ancient cities and across turbulent seas, into the hearts of his soldiers and the minds of his enemies. We will witness his courage, his ambition, and the sparks of destiny that would make his name echo across millennia. So prepare yourself. The sails are unfurled, the drums are beating, and history's tide is pulling us forward. Let us embark together to stand with Alexander, to cross the Hellespont, and to witness the dawn of a legend. The night was silent over the palace of Pella, yet young Alexander could not sleep. The moonlight spilled across the marble floor, and in the cool air of Macedonia, the prince sat by his window, staring at the distant mountains. They were not just peaks of stone to him. They were gates to the world beyond. Alexander, son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias, was no ordinary youth. At 13, he had been taught by the great philosopher Aristotle, whose wisdom filled the boy's mind with stories of Homer, the deeds of Achilles, and the distant lands where heroes were made. His heart was restless, burning with the need to carve his own legend. In the dim candlelight, he unrolled a map, not the crude sketches of most men, but a detailed chart of the known world. His finger traced the outline of the Aegean Sea, moved across the Hellespont, and into the vastness of Asia. One day, he whispered, I will cross these waters. I will do what no man has done. I will be remembered. But dreams do not grow in silence alone. His father's conquests had already brought most of Greece under Macedonian control. Yet Philip's ambitions were not merely for his own lifetime. He was preparing an army to strike at the mighty Persian Empire. Alexander knew that one day the command would fall to him. That night, as the wind rustled the palace banners, he imagined the roar of armies, the clash of shields, and the cheers of a world united under his name. It was not arrogance, it was destiny burning inside him like the eternal flame of the gods. In the shadows, Queen Olympias watched from the doorway. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, saw more than a boy with big dreams. She had told him often that he was descended from Achilles himself, a hero chosen by the gods. She nurtured his belief, fanning the fire that would one day blaze across continents. In that moment, Alexander was not a boy. He was a king in the making, a commander of nations, and the architect of an empire yet to be born. The moon climbed higher, casting a silver road across the night sky, a path that seemed to lead directly toward the Hellespont, and beyond it to eternity. The sun rose over Pella, casting golden light across the training fields. The clang of bronze against bronze rang out as soldiers drilled in perfect formation. Alexander stood at the edge, watching every movement, every pivot of the spear, every disciplined march. These men were not merely soldiers. They were the foundation of his father's dream. King Philip II of Macedon was a man forged in war. He had taken a fractured kingdom and shaped it into a military power unmatched. In Greece, his reforms had turned the phalanx into a living wall of steel, a formation that could crush even the mightiest armies. Philip's vision went beyond Macedonia's borders. His eyes were fixed eastward, toward the sprawling Persian Empire. In the royal courtyard, Philip walked alongside his son. The king's gait was strong despite the limp left by an old wound. His presence commanded attention. Even the most hardened generals lowered their heads in respect. "Alexander," Philip said, gesturing toward the training ground, "this is what will carry you across the world. Not walls, not palaces, but men like these. Treat them well, and they will follow you to the ends of the earth." Alexander listened intently, though their relationship was not without tension. The pride of the father, and the ambition of the son often clashed. Philip's achievements were undeniable. Every stone in the kingdom's walls, every soldier in its ranks, was part of the legacy Alexander would inherit. Later that day, father and son stood before a great map. Philip traced a line from Macedonia across the Aegean, over the Hellespont, and deep into Asia Minor. "Here," he said, his voice low, "is where we strike first. We will take the war to Persia, not wait for it to come to us. I will lead the way, and you will see how empires fall." Alexander felt a surge of anticipation. He was no longer just dreaming of conquest. The path was being laid before him. Yet somewhere deep inside, he knew there would come a day when the torch would pass, and it would be his hands steering the course of history. As evening fell, Philip inspected the royal arsenal. Rows of polished helmets, long spears stacked like golden wheat, and shields bearing the sunburst of Macedonia. Alexander followed silently, absorbing every detail. This was more than a father's legacy. It was the blueprint for empire, and though neither spoke it aloud, both knew the Hellespont awaited. The air in Pella was heavy with incense and grief. The grand hall was draped in black, the golden banners of Macedonia lowered in mourning. King Philip II was dead, struck down by an assassin's blade during a celebration meant to unite the kingdom. Alexander, just 20 years old, stood before the throne. His eyes were steady, but inside, a storm raged. He had lost his father, his mentor, and the shield that had stood between him and the ambitions of the world. Now, the weight of the kingdom had fallen upon his shoulders. The court was a cauldron of whispers. Some nobles doubted his youth. Others, loyal to Philip, pledged their allegiance instantly. But Alexander knew that words were not enough. In Macedonia, a king was made in the field, not just in the palace. On the day of his coronation, he wore a crimson cloak, the symbol of kingship, and the diadem upon his brow. His voice carried through the hall as he swore before the gods to protect Macedonia, to lead its people to glory, and to carry forward Philip's vision. Yet his first days as king were not filled with glory, but with blood. Several northern tribes rebelled, testing the young monarch's resolve. In a lightning campaign, Alexander rode at the head of his cavalry, striking swiftly and decisively. His victories were not just military. They were a warning to any who doubted him. The crown rested firmly on his head. In the quiet after battle, Alexander returned to Pella. Standing alone in the royal chambers, he touched the empty chair where Philip had once sat. He thought of the maps they had studied together, of the Hellespont and the lands beyond. The dream had not died with his father. It burned brighter than ever. That night, under the torchlit colonnade, he called his generals. The Persian campaign would go forward. The army his father had built was ready, and Alexander would not let time erode its edge. The throne was no longer just a seat of power. It was a burden, a responsibility, and a promise. And Alexander intended to keep it, not by guarding Macedonia's borders, but by carrying its banner across the seas to Asia. The spring air over Corinth carried the scent of salt from the nearby Gulf, mingling with the dust of marching soldiers. Alexander rode at the head of his royal guard, his crimson cloak billowing. the sun glinting off his bronze cuirass. He had come not to conquer Greece, but to bind it under one banner. The League of Corinth, forged by his father, had united the Greek city-states in a fragile alliance. But with Philip gone, the pact trembled. Athens whispered of independence, Thebes tested his patience, and Sparta, as ever, stood aloof. Alexander knew that hesitation now could shatter the unity needed for the coming war with Persia. His first move was swift and decisive. At Thebes, where murmurs of rebellion stirred, he appeared with his army before the city's walls, faster than any messenger could warn them. The Thebans, stunned by his speed, bent the knee without a fight. His message was clear: loyalty would be rewarded, defiance crushed. In Athens, he entered not as a conqueror, but as a statesman. Standing in the shadow of the Parthenon, he addressed the assembly with measured words. Nicipal, Greece shall not be the prey of Persia's pride. Stand with me, and we shall carry our vengeance across the sea. The Athenians, swayed by his charisma and the memory of Persian invasions past, pledged their ships and men. At Corinth, the council of the League gathered. Delegates from across the Greek world sat in tense rows. Alexander, young yet commanding, strode to the center, the Macedonian sunburst gleaming on his cloak. He did not lecture them. He invited them into a vision. He spoke of a war not just for vengeance, but for glory, not just for conquest, but for the liberation of Greek cities under Persian rule. By the end of the session, the alliance was renewed. Alexander was named hegemon, supreme commander, of the campaign against Persia. The weight of Greece's hopes now rested on his shoulders. As the delegates dispersed, Alexander stepped onto the balcony overlooking the Gulf. Beyond the horizon lay the Hellespont, the narrow gate to Asia. With Greece united behind him, the first great obstacle had fallen. The path to Persia was open. The harbor of Pella bustled with life. Ships groaned under the weight of supplies, barrels of grain, crates of arrows, gleaming bronze weapons. The scent of tar and salt mixed with the shouts of dockworkers and the clatter of hooves on wooden planks. Alexander stood at the pier, his eyes fixed not on the sea itself, but on the invisible line beyond the horizon, the coast of Asia Minor. The League of Corinth had given its blessing. Greece was united. Now the real work began. The campaign against Persia would not be a mere raid. It would be a war to decide the fate of two worlds. In the Royal War Council, maps covered the great table. Generals clustered around them, moving wooden markers across the Aegean Sea toward the Hellespont. Armenian, the seasoned commander who had fought under Philip, advised caution. He argued for securing the islands first, to protect the fleet. Alexander, however, favored speed, a swift crossing to strike before the Persians could fully muster their forces. The longer we wait, Alexander said, pointing at the map, the more time Darius has to prepare. We cross while the wind favors us, and we take Asia before they can stop us. Preparations moved quickly. In the armory, blacksmiths hammered day and night. Shields bore the blazing sun of Macedon. Long sarissa spears were sharpened to deadly points. Horses were groomed for the companion cavalry, their manes braided for war. The campaign was not without risk. Crossing into Asia meant leaving the safety of home. If they failed, there would be no retreat, only ruin. Yet for Alexander, the thought of turning back never entered his mind. In a quiet moment, he walked the shoreline alone, the waves lapping at his boots. He thought of Achilles sailing to Troy, of heroes whose names still lived after centuries. Soon he would follow their path, not in myth, but in reality. That evening, as the sun set in blazing gold over the Aegean, Alexander addressed his men. We go not as conquerors, but as liberators. We march to free our kin across the sea, to humble a king who sits on stolen thrones, and to make the world know the name of Macedonia. The roar of approval from thousands of voices echoed over the water. The call to Asia had been sounded, and no man in that harbor doubted that history was about to change forever. The great hall of Pella was alive with the murmur of voices, the rustle of scrolls, and the heavy thud of sandaled feet on marble. At the center stood a long oak table, its surface covered by maps, miniature ships, and carved markers representing divisions of the army. The torches along the walls flickered, casting restless shadows on the faces of men who would decide the fate of nations. Alexander entered with a measured stride, the crimson of his cloak catching the torchlight. His generals, Parmenion, Antipater, Craterus, Philotas, rose from their seats in acknowledgment. This was not a meeting of equals. It was the final shaping of a king's will into action. "Gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice steady but commanding, "the time for talk is over. We have Greece at our back, the fleet in our harbors, and the gods as our witnesses. Now we must decide how to cross the Hellespont and how to hold what we take." Parmenion leaned forward, his hand resting on the map. "We move in two waves. The first secures Abydos on the Asian shore. The second brings the cavalry and main phalanx once the beachhead is safe. Once the beachhead is safe, Craterus, ever eager for boldness, countered, "Better to strike with our full strength at once. If we hesitate, we invite the Persians to gather in greater numbers." Alexander listened without interruption, eyes shifting from one commander to another. When all had spoken, he placed his hand on the map where the narrow waters were drawn. "We will cross in one wave. Speed and surprise will be our strength. Our fleet will sail under the cover of darkness, landing at first light. Once we are ashore, we move immediately toward Troy to honor the gods and heroes before engaging the enemy." There was a moment of silence. Then, slowly, the generals nodded. The plan was dangerous, but then so was their king. The meeting turned to the details: the order of ships in the convoy, the placement of siege equipment, the signaling methods for night sailing. Messengers would ride ahead to coastal towns to prepare supplies. The companion cavalry's horses would be transported on specially built barges, while the infantry marched aboard larger transports. As the council adjourned, Alexander lingered, his eyes fixed on the small wooden model of the Hellespont. His hand brushed over it, as if feeling the current itself. In his mind, he could already hear the waves against the hulls, the creak of oars, and the first cry when Macedonian boots struck Asian soil. The war council had spoken. The course was set. In days, the greatest crossing of the age would begin. The morning in Pella was unlike any other. The streets of Bushan. The streets, usually filled with merchants and the clamor of daily life, were now lined with citizens dressed in their finest, standing shoulder to shoulder in silent anticipation. The sound of armor clinking and the steady thud of boots echoed through the air as Alexander's army gathered in perfect formation. At the palace gates, Alexander emerged astride Bucephalus, his jet-black steed. The great horse pawed the ground, nostrils flaring, as if sensing the weight of the day. Alexander's crimson cloak billowed in the cool spring wind, the golden sunburst on his breastplate catching the light. Behind him stretched an endless column of soldiers, the phalanx, the companion cavalry, engineers, and supply wagons, all prepared for the journey to the Hellespont. The people of Pella bowed their heads as the king passed, some reaching out to touch the hems of his cloak, or the flanks of the horses as a blessing. Mothers lifted their children to see the young king who would lead Macedonia into glory. At the edge of the city, Alexander reigned in Bucephalus and turned to face his people. Today, we leave not to abandon our home, but to defend it, to strike at those who would threaten our freedom, and to bring honor to Macedonia's name. When we return, it will be as victors, and our children will walk in a land made safe by our courage. His voice carried over the silent crowd, the words sinking deep into every heart. Then, in a single motion, he raised his sword toward the rising sun. The soldiers answered with a roar, the sound rolling over the city like thunder. The march began. Drums beat in steady rhythm, marking the steps of thousands. Standards bearing the Macedonian sun fluttered in the wind. The city's rooftops filled with those who watched from above, some weeping, others smiling with pride. As the army passed through the last gates, Alexander glanced back at the towers of Pella one final time. He thought of the nights studying maps with Aristotle, of his father's counsel in the training fields, and of his mother's whispered words about destiny. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but his heart was steady. Without looking back again, he spurred Bucephalus forward. The king and his army disappeared over the horizon, leaving the city in the golden haze of morning, and carrying with them the hopes of a nation. The ancient city of Aigai lay nestled between rolling green hills. Its stone walls weathered by centuries, its streets steeped in the memory of kings. Here, in the cradle of Macedonian royalty, Alexander paused on his march to the coast. The army would rally in this sacred heartland before pushing onward to the Hellespont. Great. The fields outside the city swelled with life. Thousands of soldiers had set up orderly camps. Rows of tents, cook fires sending up thin streams of smoke, smiths hammering in open workshops. The clatter of armor and the neighing of horses blended with the hum of preparation. Alexander rode through the camp with Bucephalus, inspecting every detail. He stopped to speak with veterans who had fought under Philip, clapping them on the shoulders and asking after their families. To the younger recruits, he offered words of encouragement and promise, telling them that they would not only march into history, but become its authors. In the city's central square, a great platform had been raised. That evening, with torches flaring and the banners of Macedonia hanging in the warm night air, Alexander addressed his assembly. The people of Aigai crowded at the edges, eager to witness the young king who carried the spirit of their ancestors. Here in Aigai, Alexander began, "Our kings are crowned, our heroes laid to rest. From here, our fathers set forth to defend our land, and from here, we will set forth to carry its honor beyond the seas. The Hellespont will not be a barrier, but a bridge, from Macedonia to immortality." A cheer rolled through the crowd, but Alexander lifted a hand for silence. "Remember this, we march not for plunder alone, nor for conquest alone, but for the freedom of Greeks in Asia and the glory of our name." After the speech, sacrifices were made to Zeus, Athena, and Poseidon. Priests read omens from the flames, declaring them favorable. The soldiers feasted late into the night, laughter and music echoing through the camp. But amid the revelry, there was an undercurrent of anticipation, the sense that every step from now on would carry them further from home and closer to legend. At dawn, Alexander stood upon a low hill overlooking the camp. The sun's first rays struck the spear points of the phalanx, setting them alight in gold. He took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill his chest. The time to move was near. The morning mist clung to the hills as Alexander's army broke camp at Aigai. The first rays of sunlight glinted off bronze helmets and spear points, turning the long column into a river of gold winding its way toward the sea. The steady rhythm of boots striking the earth set the pace, a march not of retreat, but of destiny. The road to the coast was more than a route. It was a moving testament to Macedonian power. Villagers emerged from their homes to watch the king's army pass. Farmers left their fields, children climbed stone fences, and elders raised their hands in blessing. Some offered bread, wine, or olives to the soldiers, tokens of support for the long journey ahead. At midday, the column paused in a small valley where clear streams fed lush meadows. Horses were watered, men rested in the shade, and armorers walked among the ranks, making quick repairs. Alexander moved freely among his men, speaking with both veterans and fresh recruits. He knew every campaign was built not only on steel, but on the hearts of those who bore it. The road wound through forests where birdsong accompanied the march, then into open plains where the wind carried the scent of the distant Aegean. Each night, the camp was set with precision, outer rings of sentries, inner rows of tents, and a central command fire where Alexander and his generals plotted the next day's course. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Alexander stood on a ridge and gazed toward the horizon. Though the sea was still hidden, he felt its presence, the vast waters that separated him from Asia and the campaign that would define his life. In the firelight, he confided to Parmenion, "Every step brings us closer to the edge of the known world, and beyond it, the empire we will forge." Parmenion nodded, the older general's eyes reflecting the flames. "And every step strengthens the men who will build it." By the sixth day, the scent of salt filled the air. The land sloped downward, and the distant glimmer of water appeared through the haze. The murmur of the waves reached the ears of the marching soldiers, quickening their pace. Soon, they would stand at the very threshold of history, the ports from which they would launch themselves into Asia. The march toward the coast was never meant to be a straight line. To the north lay Thrace, a rugged land of mountains and fierce tribes whose loyalty to Macedonia was never guaranteed. If left unchecked, they could threaten Alexander's supply lines before he even reached the Hellespont. It was early morning when the scouts returned with word. A Thracian warband had been sighted blocking the narrow pass ahead. The air was cool, the mist still clinging to the pines. When Alexander gave the order to advance, his voice carried no hesitation, only the calm certainty of a man who knew that hesitation was more dangerous than battle. The pass was a winding trail, hemmed in by cliffs. From above, Thracian warriors shouted in their guttural tongue, banging their weapons against shields in a show of defiance. Their cloaks were dyed in deep reds and blacks, their hair bound in braids, their long curved swords glinting in the dim light. Alexander halted his phalanx just outside bowshot and rode forward on Bucephalus, flanked by the companion cavalry. "This is Macedonian land," he called out in their language, learned during his youth. "Stand aside, and you will be spared. Resist, and I will break you." The Thracian leader, a tall man with a wolfskin draped over his shoulders, laughed and raised his sword. The echo of that defiance was answered not with words, but with the deep drumbeat of the Macedonian advance. The phalanx surged forward, sarissas angled upward to deflect stones and arrows from above. Archers returned fire in deadly arcs, while the companion cavalry circled wide to strike from the flank. The clash was sudden and fierce. The metallic hiss of swords, the crack of spears on shields, the shouts of men locked in mortal struggle. Within minutes, the Thracian line faltered. Their leader fell, his wolfskin torn from his shoulders. "Agato!" Seeing their resistance crumble, Alexander signaled for the attack to cease. Survivors were offered mercy in exchange for pledging loyalty to Macedonia. Many accepted, their hands still trembling from the fight. By midday, the pass was clear. The army moved on, the banners of Macedonia fluttering in the wind, the silence of the mountains now broken only by the steady tramp of boots. Alexander had secured his northern flank, a small victory on the road to far greater challenges. The river Strymon cut through the Macedonian landscape like a silver serpent, its broad, fast-flowing waters glistening in the morning sun. To most travelers, it was a simple boundary. To Alexander's army, it was the next obstacle on the road to the Hellespont. The spring melt from the mountains had swollen the river, turning its current swift and unpredictable. Standing on the western bank, Alexander studied the waters in silence. The murmuring of the current was joined by the low voices of his generals, debating the safest method of crossing. "We could build a bridge of rafts," suggested Parmenion. "It would take a day, but the men would remain dry and our supplies intact." Craterus countered, "Every day we wait, the Persians prepare. The current is strong, but our men are stronger. We ford it now." Alexander weighed their words, then turned to his men. "The Strymon will not delay us. We will cross together, in strength and in order. No man will be left behind." The preparations began at once. Horses were led to the shallows. Wagons were lashed together with ropes and stripped of excess weight. The companion cavalry dismounted and waded in first, forming a living barrier against the current for the infantry to follow. Soldiers linked arms in rows, using their shields as braces against the force of the water. The river fought them at every step. The icy water reached their waists, then their chests, threatening to sweep away any who faltered. Yet the discipline of the phalanx held, each man supporting the one beside him. From the shore, Alexander rode Bucephalus along the line, shouting encouragement, his voice carrying over the roar of the river. Midway across, a soldier lost his footing, the current dragging him downstream. Without hesitation, two of his comrades broke formation and seized his arms, hauling him back into line. Alexander saw it and raised his sword in salute, a silent acknowledgment of the bond that made his army more than just a collection of men. At last, dripping and shivering, the army emerged onto the eastern bank. Fires were lit to warm the men, and armor was set to dry in neat rows. Alexander dismounted and walked among them, praising their resolve. "This," he said with a smile, "is how empires are won, not with the crossing of seas alone, but with the strength to master every river that stands in our way." The Strymon was behind them now, its current carrying away only the foam of their passing. Ahead lay the ports that would take them to the Hellespont, and the gates of Asia. The wind off the Aegean carried the tang of salt and the promise of distant shores as Alexander's army descended from the inland hills toward the sea. Before them lay Sestos, a bustling port city perched on the European side of the Hellespont, its harbors crowded with ships, its streets alive with merchants, sailors, and soldiers preparing for the greatest crossing of the age. The sight stirred the ranks. For weeks they had marched through mountains, rivers, and hostile lands. Now, the water they had long envisioned shimmered before their eyes, the strait separating them from Asia glinting in the afternoon sun. Alexander entered the city at the head of his companion cavalry, Bucephalus tossing his head impatiently as the crowds pressed in on either side. Citizens, traders, and fishermen lined the streets, shouting blessings and offering garlands. Dockworkers paused from loading amphorae and grain sacks onto ships to salute the young king who would lead Greece into the Persian heartland. Why? New. The harbor was a hive of purposeful chaos. Triremes and transport vessels bobbed in the tide, their sails furled, their decks piled high with supplies. Rows of siege engines, ballistae, catapults, and battering rams were being secured aboard sturdy cargo ships. Horses were led up wooden gangplanks, stamping nervously at the unfamiliar sway beneath their hooves. In the governor's hall overlooking the port, Alexander convened his commanders. A massive chart of the Hellespont was unrolled across a marble table, showing currents, depths, and the Persian watchtowers on the opposite shore. Armenian spoke of the timing, Craterus of the order of embarkation, and the Admiral Nicanor of wind and tide. Alexander listened, then placed his hand flat on the map. This strait is the threshold between the world we know and the one we will conquer. We cross it not as raiders, but as kings in the making. Outside, the soldiers prepared for the days ahead. Armor was polished, weapons sharpened, rations packed into sealed barrels. Priests moved among the ranks, blessing the men and offering libations to Poseidon, god of the sea, that the crossing might be swift and without loss. As the sun sank toward the horizon, Alexander stood on the breakwater, gazing east. The Asian shore lay faint and hazy in the distance, just beyond the reach of mortal hands. For now, soon the tide would turn, and with it, the course of history. The Hellespont stretched before Alexander like a shimmering ribbon of liquid gold, beneath the late afternoon sun. Its waters, narrow yet treacherous, marked the border between Europe and Asia. On the far shore, the hills of Asia Minor rose in a hazy blue silhouette, so close that it seemed a strong swimmer could reach them. Yet history warned that the strait could be as dangerous as any battlefield. For 3 days, the army waited at Sestos. The wind was fickle, shifting from gentle breezes to sudden gusts that churned the waters into white-capped waves. Alexander knew that to cross prematurely would risk disaster. He had seen fleets broken apart by the whims of Poseidon. Each morning, the port awoke to the sound of shipbuilders, making final adjustments, tightening ropes, checking hull seams, reinforcing masts. Priests performed daily sacrifices on the breakwater, casting offerings into the sea to honor the gods of wind and water. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries carried on the shifting breeze, as if they too waited for the signal to depart. Alexander spent these days walking the docks, speaking with sailors, examining every vessel, and ensuring that no part of the fleet was left wanting. He conferred with Nicanor, the fleet admiral, on the best formations for the crossing, warships in the lead to guard against Persian attack, followed by troop transports and supply ships. By the third evening, the winds had turned favorable. The sea lay calmer, the current steady, carrying its flow from the Black Sea toward the Aegean, the very direction they would sail. In the fading light, Alexander gathered his generals on the pier. The smell of tar and salt hung heavy in the air as he spoke. The gods have given us their blessing. At dawn we sail. Every man here will set foot on the soil of Asia, and when we do, the world will know that Macedonia does not stop at the water's edge. That night, the harbor glowed with torchlight. Soldiers sat in quiet groups, sharpening weapons, braiding horse manes, or staring out across the dark water toward the unseen shore. The sound of the wind in the rigging and the gentle slap of waves against the hulls filled the air. Alexander stood alone at the end of the breakwater, his crimson cloak fluttering in the breeze. He looked east, toward the land where his destiny awaited, and whispered a silent vow. He would cross not just the Hellespont, but every boundary that dared to stand before him. Dawn broke over Sestos in a blaze of gold, the first light glimmering on the calm waters of the Hellespont. The air was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Today, Alexander would call upon the gods to bless the crossing. A great altar had been erected on the breakwater, its stone face carved with waves and sea creatures, and garlands of laurel draped across its base. Before it, priests in white robes moved with solemn precision, their hands carrying bowls of incense and jugs of wine. The scent of burning herbs mingled with the sharp tang of salt air. The army gathered along the waterfront, forming a wide semicircle around the altar. The crews of the triremes stood at attention on their decks, spears upright, shields gleaming. Even the horses, restless in their pens, seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Alexander stepped forward, clad in ceremonial armor, a gleaming bronze cuirass polished to mirror brightness, his crimson cloak flowing behind him, and a wreath of fresh laurel upon his brow. In his hands he carried a golden bowl of wine and a small ceremonial dagger. He began with an invocation. Poseidon, Lord of the deep, Master of the tides, hear us. Grant that we cross your waters in safety and reach the shores of Asia with your blessing. As you guard the fisherman and the merchant, so guard the warrior who sails for honor and glory. At his signal, the priests brought forth a white bull, its horns gilded, its flanks gleaming from oil. The animal's breath rose in warm clouds against the cool morning air. Alexander took the dagger and with a swift, practiced motion made the sacrifice. The bull's blood spilled into a bronze basin, from which the priests poured libations into the sea. The crowd stood in reverent silence as the waves carried the offering away. Then the high priest raised his arms and proclaimed the Coman favorable, a sign that Poseidon himself favored the expedition. Trumpets sounded, echoing over the harbor. The men cheered, their voices carrying across the water, mingling with the cries of seabirds. Sailors loosened ropes, and the sails of the leading triremes began to unfurl, catching the early light like wings of white fire. Alexander turned to his men and spoke with the fire of a commander, whose heart was already across the sea. Today we give to the gods what is theirs, so that tomorrow they give us what is ours. Asia awaits, and we shall not keep her waiting. The cheers rose again, a sound as steady and unbroken as the tide. The gods had been honored. The crossing would begin. The sun climbed higher over the port of Sestos, casting a warm glow over a sight few in history had ever seen. The full might of Alexander's expedition gathered in one place. From the breakwater to the farthest edge of the bay, ships filled the harbor like a forest of masts, their sails furled, their hulls gleaming in the light. War triremes, their prows carved into the shapes of lions, rams, and sea gods, formed the vanguard. Behind them, sturdy transport vessels lay heavy with soldiers, siege engines, and supplies. Further back, smaller craft darted between the giants, ferrying messages, tools, and final loads of provisions. The air was alive with the shouts of sailors, the creak of ropes, and the rhythmic thud of oars in practice. Alexander walked the length of the main pier, Bucephalus pacing beside him. He inspected each ship, speaking to captains, checking the readiness of crews, and noting every detail: the tightness of the rigging, the balance of the cargo, the discipline of the rowers. No flaw would be allowed to endanger the crossing. On the shore, soldiers moved in orderly lines, boarding according to the plan agreed in the war council. The companion cavalry's horses were led up broad gangplanks, their hooves thudding against the wood, nostrils flaring at the scent of tar and salt. Siege weapons were rolled aboard with the help of winches, their iron bolts and stones stacked nearby. Amphorae of wine, sacks of grain, and bundles of dried meat were loaded by the hundreds. At the center of the harbor, the flagship awaited, a trireme longer and broader than the rest, its prow plated in bronze, its deck decorated with the Macedonian sunburst. This vessel would carry Alexander himself, along with his senior generals, across the strait. The ship's crew, hand-picked from the most skilled sailors in the fleet, stood ready at their posts. As the last units boarded, Alexander climbed the gangway to the flagship's deck. From there, he could see the entirety of his force, the ordered rows of ships, the disciplined ranks of soldiers, the banners snapping in the wind. It was more than an army. It was the instrument by which he would change the world. "Look well, my friends," he called to the generals beside him, his voice carrying across the water. "This fleet is not merely wood and sail. It is the will of Macedonia given shape. That will touch Asia." The call of the bosun's horn echoed across the harbor, signaling the fleet's final readiness. The sun dipped toward the horizon, bathing the ships in gold. Tomorrow they would sail. The dawn came soft and clear, the sky painted in pale rose and gold as the fleet of Alexander the Great slipped from the harbor of Sestos. Oars dipped into the calm waters of the Hellespont in perfect rhythm, their steady splash blending with the creak of timbers and the flap of sails, catching the morning breeze. From the deck of his flagship, Alexander stood at the prow, Bucephalus safely stabled below. The salt wind tugged at his crimson cloak, carrying with it the faint slant of the open sea. Around him, the war triremes formed a protective screen, their bronze rams gleaming in the light. Behind them, the transport vessels bore the heart of the Macedonian army, the phalanx, the cavalry, the siege engines, and the supplies that would sustain them in the coming campaign. The waters of the Hellespont narrowed, and the Asian shore grew clearer with each passing moment. Rolling hills covered in spring grass rose gently from the coastline, dotted with small settlements and crowned by distant ridges. Somewhere beyond those hills lay the ancient city of Troy, a place Alexander had dreamed of since boyhood. The soldiers crowded the rails, pointing toward the shore and speaking in hushed voices. For many, this was their first sight of Asia, the fabled land of wealth, mystery, and danger. The moment was more than geographic. It was symbolic, the crossing of a threshold between two worlds. Alexander remained silent for a long while, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Then he turned to Parmenion, who stood at his side. "There it is, the land of our fathers' dreams and our enemies' pride. We will take it as our own." The Admiral Nicanor approached, reporting the fleet's progress and the favorable winds. Alexander gave a single nod. "Keep the formation tight. I want the Persians to see our strength before they feel it." As the morning sun climbed higher, the coastline's details sharpened. Rocky outcrops, stretches of sandy beach, and the faint glimmer of watchtowers. The fleet moved like a living creature, the disciplined oarsmen and alert sailors guiding each ship with precision. By midday, the land seemed close enough to touch. The men gripped their weapons with renewed purpose. Asia was no longer a distant dream. It was real within reach. And waiting, the fleet cut steadily through the calm morning waters, the rhythmic pull of the oars a heartbeat for the entire expedition. The Singsaut Anxios, no longer a distant dream but a vivid reality. Green hills rolling down to rocky headlands, white foam curling against the beaches. On the deck of his flagship, Alexander stood at the prow, hands gripping the rail, eyes unblinking. His generals gathered behind him, their gazes shifting between their king and the approaching shore. The men sensed the weight of the moment. The crossing of the Hellespont was more than a maneuver of war. It was an act that would be remembered for centuries. The fleet slowed as it neared the designated landing point near Abydos. Alexander turned to Parmenion and Nicanor. "Hold the line. Let the lead ships form a wall for the landing craft. No chaos, no hesitation." The first wave of smaller boats, packed with infantry, slid into the water. Rowers bent low over their oars, driving the craft toward the sand. Alexander did not wait for the shore to come to him. He leapt down into the nearest boat, the wood rocking beneath his boots. Soldiers pressed close around him, their shields raised, their eyes fixed on the beach ahead. As the bow grated into the shallows, Alexander sprang into the knee-deep surf, water splashing high against his bronze greaves. With deliberate slowness he drew his sword and raised it overhead, the blade catching the sun in a dazzling flash. Men of Macedonia, his voice rang out over the roar of the surf. We step into Asia not as trespassers, but as its rightful heirs. Follow me, and let the world remember this day. The soldiers surged forward, their boots churning up sand and spray. Behind them, the banners of the sunburst unfurled in the wind, and the beach began to fill with the ranks of the phalanx. War horns sounded from the flagship, signaling the landing of the cavalry and siege units. On the ridge above, a small band of Persian scouts watched, their silhouettes stark against the bright sky. They turned and vanished inland, messengers carrying word that Alexander had come. The last of the infantry formed ranks on the beach, shields braced, spears angled toward the hills. Alexander stood at the front, the water still dripping from his armor, a faint smile on his lips. The crossing was complete, history had been altered, and the campaign had truly begun. The beachhead at Abydos was secure. Macedonian banners rippled in the sea breeze, and the last ships of the fleet were unloading men, horses, and supplies. But before the army moved inland, Alexander had one final act to bind his men together in purpose, an oath that would echo in their hearts long after the surf had dried from their armor. At his command, the flagship was anchored just offshore, its deck cleared of everything but a great bronze shield mounted upright near the mast. Around it, the generals and senior officers gathered. The rest of the army assembled on the sand and the smaller ships nearby, their eyes fixed on the ceremony. Alexander stepped forward, still in the armor he had worn for the landing, droplets of seawater tracing bright lines down the bronze. In his right hand, he carried a spear, in his left, a shallow bronze bowl filled with unmixed wine. He raised his voice so it carried over the water. Men of Macedonia, Greeks of the League, allies and friends, today we stand where no army from our homeland has stood before. The sea lies behind us, Asia lies before us. Between them there is no retreat, only victory or death. The soldiers answered with a low, steady rumble of assent, the sound like distant thunder. Before the gods who watch us, Alexander continued, I swear to lead you not for my own glory alone, but for the honor of all Greece and the freedom of those who live under the Persian yoke. I will fight where you fight, suffer what you suffer, and never ask of you what I would not dare myself. He tipped the bowl, pouring the wine onto the deck, the crimson liquid running across the wood to stain the great bronze shield. Then he held his spear high and shouted, Now swear with me. Thousands of voices roared in answer, soldiers lifting their weapons toward the sky. We swear! The sound rolled across the water, startling the seabirds into flight. Parmenion stepped forward, placing his hand on the shield. We fight as one. One by one, the generals followed, each touching the shield in silent pledge. Alexander turned, sweeping his gaze across the men on shore and ship alike. Then let Asia beware. The gods are witness, and our oath is sealed. The call of the war horns followed, deep and resonant. The landing was complete. The oath had been made. The march inland would begin with the weight of every man's vow pressing them forward. The oars dipped in perfect rhythm, their wooden blades flashing in the sunlight before vanishing into the dark green waters. The fleet was now deep in the middle of the Hellespont, the shorelines of both Europe and Asia equally distant. Two continents, suspended like twin worlds on the edge of the horizon. Alexander stood at the prow of his flagship, the wind snapping his crimson cloak. Behind him, the steady drumbeat of the coxswain set the pace for the rowers. The smell of salt and tar filled the air, mingling with the low creak of timbers and the murmured voices of soldiers. For a moment, all of them were caught in a strange stillness of the mind, the knowledge that they were between worlds, not yet having left one, not yet having entered the other. The men glanced from shore to shore, each absorbing the enormity of what they were doing. "This is the threshold," Alexander said quietly to Parmenion, who stood at his side. "Once we pass it, there is no turning back." Parmenion nodded. "A king's road is always one way." Talus. The water shimmered with the movement of the fleet. Ahead, triremes cut through the gentle chop, their bronze rams glinting like spears. The transport ships followed in tight formation, their decks crowded with phalanx soldiers who stood watching the horizon, shields strapped to their backs, spears stacked at their sides. In the open deck space, a group of priests offered a final libation to Poseidon, pouring wine over the side so that it mixed with the waves. The sailors whispered quick prayers under their breath, touching amulets for luck. Even hardened veterans who scoffed at omens kept their eyes on the sky, as if reading the will of the gods in the drifting clouds. Midway across, the current surged more strongly, tugging at the hulls. The oarsmen bent low with the effort, muscles straining. Alexander moved along the deck, speaking briefly to the rowers, offering encouragement as his hand tapped the rim of the hull in a steady rhythm. His presence brought renewed vigor to the men, and the fleet held its pace. Then, almost imperceptibly, the Asian shore began to grow larger. The hills seemed to lean toward them as if inviting or challenging their arrival. The murmurs among the soldiers grew louder, their anticipation building like the rising tide. The middle was past. The ships pressed onward. Behind them, Europe began to fade into the blue haze. Ahead, Asia grew clearer, its coastline etched in light. Alexander tightened his grip on the railing and allowed himself the smallest smile. The die was cast. The Asian coast was close now, so close that the shapes of rocky outcrops and strips of pale sand could be seen clearly. The fleet could have pressed on and landed within the hour, but Alexander raised his hand from the prow of the flagship, signaling for the coxswain's drum to fall silent. The titty. One by one, the oars slowed, the great ships drifting to a gentle halt upon the rolling swells of the Hellespont. A stillness spread across the fleet. Sailcloth flapped lazily overhead, and the creak of rigging was the only sound. Even the men, eager to set foot on new soil, seemed to feel the weight of the pause. Alexander wanted this moment, the last before Asia, the last before history turned a page. "Hold the ship steady," he ordered Nicanor, the admiral. "Let the men look, let them understand where they are." Standing tall at the prow, Alexander gestured to both horizons. "Behind us lies all we have ever known. Before us lies everything we can yet become. Between them, here on these waters, we are neither. And we are both." His voice was calm, but it carried over the quiet sea. Parmenion stepped closer, eyes on the distant shore. "You give them time to breathe before the climb begins." "I give them time to remember why we climb," Alexander replied. Priests moved to the railings with small clay cups of wine, and poured them into the sea as final offerings to Poseidon. A gentle breeze shifted, carrying the scent of the Asian shore to the men. The faint tang of grasslands, wildflowers, and distant wood smoke. It was as if the land itself was calling to them. The men began to murmur among themselves, pointing to landmarks on the coast. Some spoke of Troy, others of the Persian satraps who awaited them. But the nervousness that often comes before battle was tempered by the sense that they were part of something greater than themselves, a story that would be told long after they were gone. After a few minutes, Alexander lifted his hand again. "Enough," he said, the steel returning to his voice. "We go forward." The coxswain's drum resumed its steady beat. The oars dipped back into the water, and the fleet began to move once more. The pause was over. The next step would take them from the shifting deck of the ship to the solid earth of Asia, and from there, into the heart of empire. The shoreline of Abydos lay just ahead, the pale sweep of its beach framed by low green hills and rocky headlands. The fleet pressed forward in perfect formation, the oars of the lead triremes slicing the water with unbroken rhythm. War horns sounded from the flagship, their deep notes rolling across the strait like the first heartbeat of invasion. On the deck of his ship, Alexander stood at the prow, Bucephalus stabled below, watching the waves crash softly against the sand. His crimson cloak whipped in the wind, the golden sunburst on his cuirass flashing in the morning light. Around him, generals and captains made ready for the landing, checking weapons, tightening straps, and scanning the hills for any sign of Persian resistance. The first ships slid into the shallows, their hulls grinding gently against the sand. Gangplanks dropped, and heavily armed infantry began to disembark, shields raised, spears angled toward the shore. Behind them came the companion cavalry, leading their steeds carefully into the surf before mounting and forming ranks on the firm ground above the tide line. Alexander was not content to wait. He leapt from the prow into the surf, the cold water swirling around his bronze greaves. Wading ashore, he planted his spear into the sand and raised his sword high, waiting coyly, the sunlight catching the blade in a dazzling flash. "Men of Macedonia," he called, his voice carrying over the sound of waves and the creak of timbers. "Asia lies before us, the land of kings and empires. Today we claim our place among them." Cheers erupted along the beach. Soldiers thudded spear butts into the sand in unison, a drumbeat of defiance and triumph. Standard-bearers planted the banners of the sunburst in the ground, their cloth snapping in the brisk sea wind. The phalanx formed into a solid wall, ready to march inland. At a moment's notice, from the hills above, a handful of Persian scouts watched the landing. They were too few to challenge the invaders. Instead, they turned their horses and vanished into the interior, messengers racing to carry word to their satraps. Within the hour, the entire vanguard was ashore, followed by the supply trains and siege equipment. Fires were lit to dry-soaked clothing, and camp was established just beyond the tide's reach. The army had set its first footprint in Asia. It was more than a military maneuver. It was the opening sentence in the chapter. Alexander had long dreamed of writing. The surf receded, leaving behind wet sand that gleamed in the morning light. Alexander stood at the water's edge, his boots sinking slightly into the grains as each wave rolled back. The fleet was still unloading, soldiers, cavalry, siege gear, but the king had paused. This was no ordinary disembarkation. It was the first time his feet touched the soil of Asia. Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, scooping a handful of wet sand into his palm. The grains glistened as the sunlight caught the water between them. He held them up for all to see, letting them fall back to the ground in a thin stream. "Asia," he said, almost as if speaking to the land itself, "you are ours now. By the will of the gods, by the strength of our arms, and by the courage of those who follow me." Behind him, the phalanx was forming along the upper beach, shields flashing in the light, the long sarissas angled toward the inland hills. The companion cavalry trotted in along the shoreline, their horses tossing their heads as they settled into formation. The air was filled with the mingled sounds of marching boots, creaking leather, and the occasional distant cry of seabirds. Parmenion approached, dismounting to stand beside Alexander. "Shall we press on toward Troy?" he asked. Alexander's eyes remained on the horizon. "Soon, but first we mark this moment. Let every man remember the first step, so that the last step, when we stand in Persepolis, will be all the more sweet." At his order, the standard-bearers planted the banners of Macedonia and the League of Corinth side by side in the sand. Priests came forward with bowls of wine, pouring libations into the earth while chanting prayers to Zeus, Athena, and Poseidon. The scent of incense mixed with the sharp tang of salt air. Then Alexander addressed the assembled officers and soldiers. "Today, we have crossed the line between what is and what will be. We have left behind the safety of our homes for the challenge of the unknown. But we have also left behind the limits others would place upon us. This land is the threshold to glory, and we will cross it together." The men answered with a cheer so loud it startled the horses. Alexander lifted his sword high, and the sunlight danced along its edge. The campaign in Asia had begun with one step, and with it the promise of an empire. The road from Abydos wound inland through green hills and olived groves before turning toward the plains of the Scamander River. There, beyond the winding waters, rose the mounds and ruins of ancient Troy, the city of Homer's epics, where Achilles, Hector, and countless heroes had fought and died. For Alexander, it was not just a place on a map, it was the meeting point between myth and history. The army halted at the edge of the plain. Alexander, accompanied only by his companion cavalry and a small honor guard, rode forward toward the ancient citadel. The wind carried with it the smell of wild thyme and the faint rustle of tall grass over the buried stones. Within the crumbling walls stood the remnants of temples, older than memory. The priests of Troy, now a small but steadfast community, came to greet the Macedonian king. They led him to the temple of Athena, its weathered columns streaked with centuries of sun and rain. Alexander dismounted before the temple steps. His crimson cloak swayed gently in the breeze as he climbed to the altar. In his hands he carried a golden bowl of wine and a wreath of fresh laurel. Before the watching priests and his closest companions, he poured the wine as a libation to Athena, patroness of heroes, and placed the laurel wreath upon the altar stone. "Goddess of wisdom and war," he said in a clear voice, "I stand in the shadow of those you once favored. As they fought for honor, so shall we. As they claimed glory, so shall we. And may you guide us to victory." From there, the king moved to the burial mound said to hold the remains of Achilles. Kneeling in the long grass, he drew his own cloak aside and placed upon the grave his own shield, a temporary gift in exchange for a heros blessing. From one son of Greece to another, he murmured, "Watch over me in the battles to come." Parmenion, standing nearby, smiled faintly. "You honor them well. Now, perhaps they will honor you." The ceremony ended with the sacrifice of a white bull on the plains. Before the city, its smoke rising into the clear sky, the soldiers watched in silence, some bowing their heads, others gazing with awe at the place where the greatest warriors of legend had once walked. For Alexander, the moment was more than piety. It was a declaration. By linking his campaign to the legacy of Troy, he claimed not only to walk in the footsteps of the heroes, But to surpass them, the morning after the sacrifice at Troy dawned clear and bright, a soft breeze carrying the scent of the Scamander plains. Alexander rose early, leaving his tent to walk once more through the ruins of the ancient city. The priests of Troy awaited him at the temple of Athena, their faces solemn, for today they would present him with a relic steeped in legend. Inside the temple's dim interior, shafts of sunlight pierced through cracks in the roof, falling upon a large bronze shield mounted upon the wall. Its surface was dented and worn, yet the faint designs of stars, waves, and warriors still shimmered when the light struck at certain angles. The high priest stepped forward, his voice low and reverent. It is said this shield was kept here for centuries, as a memory of the great Achilles, who fought and died on these very plains. Whether made by the gods or by the finest smiths of old, it carries the spirit of the hero. Today we offer it to you, Alexander, that you may carry his courage as your own. Alexander approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the temple's stillness. He reached out, fingers brushing over the cool bronze. The dents spoke of battle. The fading designs spoke of time. Lifting it from the wall, he felt its weight, not heavy in the arm, but heavy in meaning. If Achilles once bore this, Alexander said, then I carry not just a shield, but a promise that I will not rest until my deeds surpass his. Parmenion, standing near the temple entrance, gave a wry smile, a bold vow. But then, you have always preferred bold vows. The priests performed a brief blessing, sprinkling the shield with wine and touching it with olive branches. When the ceremony ended, Alexander stepped outside into the sunlight, the shield on his arm. The companion cavalry waiting in the courtyard straightened at the sight. To them, it was not merely an artifact. It was a sign that their king marched with the favor of the heroes themselves. Word spread quickly through the camp. Soldiers came to see the shield, murmuring about its history and what it might mean for the campaign. Alexander allowed them to look, even to touch its surface, for he wanted them to share in the symbolism that they were not just Macedonians, but inheritors of a legacy stretching back to the age of myth. As the sun rose higher, the shield of Achilles gleamed brightly in the king's grasp. Soon, it would see battle again, this time in the hands of one who intended to carve his own place among the immortals. The road from Troy wound southward along the Aegean coast, the sea glittering to the west and low hills rolling to the east. Alexander's army moved in steady formation, banners of the sunburst flapping in the wind. Scouts rode ahead, not in search of enemies, but to confirm the reports that Greek cities under Persian rule lay in their path. Near midday, they crested a hill and saw the first of these settlements, a walled town with terracotta roofs clustered around a small harbor. Word of Alexander's landing had clearly reached the inhabitants. The city gates stood open, and a crowd gathered just beyond them, waving branches of olive and laurel in greeting. Alexander ordered the army to halt, and approached the gates with only his honor guard. The townsfolk, men in wool tunics, women in flowing chitons, and children clutching their mothers' skirts, pressed forward eagerly. The elders stepped to the front, carrying a large bronze key and a ceremonial loaf of bread. "We welcome you, son of Philip," the eldest said, bowing low. "You come not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. For too long, we have paid tribute to the Persian satraps. Today, we open our gates to Greece." Alexander accepted the key with both hands, a gesture of respect. "Your city will have its freedom," he said, his voice carrying to the edges of the crowd. "No Persian shall tax your harvest or take your sons for their armies. You will govern yourselves, as Greeks should." The crowd erupted in cheers. Women brought forward baskets of fresh figs, loaves of bread and jugs of wine, offering them to the Macedonian soldiers. Children stared wide-eyed at the towering hoplites, some daring to touch the gleaming bronze of their shields. The men of the phalanx, smiling despite themselves, accepted the gifts and shared water with the townspeople. That evening, a feast was held in the central square. Musicians played lyres and flutes, while dancers spun beneath the light of oil lamps. Alexander sat with the city's leaders, discussing the state of nearby towns still under Persian control. He promised them protection in exchange for supplies and information. Before the night ended, he addressed the townsfolk once more. "We march not to take from you, but to return what was stolen. The freedom of one Greek city is the freedom of all." The cheers that followed were loud enough to reach the harbor, where the ships of the fleet rocked gently at anchor. For Alexander, this welcome was more than a gesture. It was proof that his campaign could win not only with the sword, but with the promise of liberation. The sea was left behind as Alexander's army turned eastward, the road climbing into the interior of Asia Minor. The air grew drier, the scent of salt giving way to the fragrance of pine and wild herbs. Villages dotted the valleys, their terracotta roofs peeking from groves of olive and fig trees, but beyond them stretched the open country where the Persian satrapies held sway. The Macedonian column wound through narrow passes and wide plains, moving with the discipline of a living machine. At the head rode the companion cavalry, sunlight flashing off their polished breastplates. Behind them came the phalanx, their long sarissas upright like a forest of spears. The supply train trailed in an orderly line, wagons creaking, oxen lowing, horses snorting, as they pulled siege engines built for cities yet unconquered. Along the way, they passed through Greek-speaking towns that opened their gates eagerly, cheering the army as liberators. But not all settlements were. In a small fortified village, the gates remained barred, and a Persian garrison watched from the walls. Alexander halted the army just out of bowshot and sent a herald forward. "Tell your satrap," the herald called, "that the army of Alexander offers you freedom. Open your gates and live as Greeks once more, or stand with the Persians and be treated as the enemy." After tense deliberation, the gates creaked open. The garrison surrendered their arms, and the village pledged allegiance to Alexander. The victory was bloodless, but its message was clear. Resistance would be met, yet mercy was offered to those who chose alliance. As the days passed, the road climbed into higher terrain. Scouts reported sightings of Persian cavalry, shadowing their march from the ridges. They never attacked, but their presence was a reminder that Darius' satraps were watching. Alexander ordered the men to maintain tight formation, knowing that speed was their best defense against harassment. At night, the campfires stretched across the dark hills like a constellation fallen to earth. In the command tent, Alexander studied maps by lamplight with Parmenion and his other generals. The goal was clear: press inland, secure key cities, and force the Persians to meet him on ground of his choosing. On the seventh day inland, Alexander paused at a high ridge. Before him stretched the rolling expanse of Asia Minor, a mosaic of fields, rivers, and distant mountains. He turned to his men, raising his voice over the wind. "We have crossed the sea, and now we cross into the heart of the empire. Every step takes us closer to their throne." The soldiers cheered, their voices carrying across the valleys. The march continued. Each footfall another mark in the long road to conquest. The sun hung low over the hills as Alexander's army wound its way along a narrow ridge road. The day had been long, the heat shimmering above the rocky slopes, when a sudden cry went up from the scouts ahead. A great eagle, its wings broad as a warrior's shield, soared directly over the marching column. its shadow sweeping across. It circled 3 times above Alexander before gliding eastward, toward the heart of Asia. The men murmured among themselves, pointing skyward. Some called it a sign from Zeus himself, blessing their advance. Alexander, smiling faintly, raised his arm to follow the eagle's path. "Where the king of the sky flies, we will follow," he declared, and the words spread through the ranks like fire in dry grass. Later that same day, as the army camped in a sheltered valley, the priests came to Alexander's tent. They had been observing the flames of the evening sacrifices, and they spoke with excitement. The smoke rose straight and unbroken into the sky, an omen of victory without delay. Parmenion, ever the pragmatist, folded his arms. "Omens or no, it is our discipline that will bring victory." "Discipline," Alexander replied, "is the will of the gods made into action." That night, a sudden wind swept through the camp, snapping banners and scattering sparks from the fires. Some men took it as a warning, others as a sign of Poseidon's favor after the successful crossing. The priests offered extra libations, chanting prayers to calm the restless powers. In the days that followed, other signs emerged. A lone white horse wandered into camp from the hills, unbranded and unclaimed. It approached Alexander without fear, nuzzling at his hand. The king took it as a gift from the gods and ordered it kept in the royal stables. Soldiers whispered that it was an omen of swiftness and triumph in the battles ahead. Each omen, whether in the sky, the earth, or the camp, seemed to bind the men tighter to their cause. They believed they were not marching alone, that the gods themselves traveled with them. As the column pushed onward, Alexander kept these moments in mind. He did not allow superstition to cloud his strategy, but he understood its power over men's hearts. To them, the eagle, the flames, the wind, and the white horse were more than chance events. They were promises, and a promise, Alexander knew, could be as strong as any spear. Orders went out across the empire. Satraps were instructed to muster their forces, fortify river crossings, and watch the roads. Envoys rode to recruit Greek mercenaries, promising gold for loyalty. In the halls of Sardis, Persian generals debated strategy. Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek in Persian service, argued for a scorched earth policy, burning the coastal cities to deny Alexander supplies. "We cannot match him in discipline or speed," Memnon warned. "We must let hunger and distance break him." But Arates, unwilling to destroy the cities under his charge, rejected the proposal. "We will meet him at the Granicus," he declared, slamming his fist on the table. "We will drown his ambition in that river." In the days that followed, the Persian host began to gather. Cavalry from Cappadocia, archers from Lydia, and infantry from the satrapies marched toward the Granicus River, their banners fluttering with the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda. War drums echoed through the valleys, and campfires lit the night like scattered constellations. Far away, Alexander's scouts reported these movements to the Macedonian king. He studied the news with a faint smile. "They come to meet us sooner than I hoped," he said. "Then we will meet them sooner than they expect." The game had begun, and both sides were moving their pieces toward the first great clash. The Granicus River cut a silver line through the plains of Asia Minor, its waters running fast from the spring melt in the mountains. The banks were steep in places, lined with reeds and low shrubs. For the Persians, it was a natural barrier. For Alexander, it was merely the first test. Late in the afternoon, Macedonian scouts returned with urgent news. A Persian force, smaller than the main army but heavily armed, was holding a section of the riverbank ahead. It was not the great battle to come, but an attempt to slow his advance. Alexander ordered the column forward. As they approached the river, the Persian cavalry could be seen on the opposite bank. Riders in scale armor, their banners fluttering in the warm breeze. Archers stood behind them, arrows already nocked, waiting for the signal to fire. Parmenion urged caution. The river is swift here, and they hold the high ground. We could camp upstream and cross at dawn. Alexander shook his head, his eyes narrowing at the enemy line. If we wait, they will only grow bolder. We take the far bank today and show them the cost of standing in our path. The companion cavalry formed at the front, their horses stamping impatiently in the shallows. Alexander positioned himself at their head, Bucephalus pawing at the water. With a sharp signal, the Macedonians charged into the river, the spray rising in silver arcs around them. Persian arrows hissed through the air, striking shields and splashing harmlessly into the current. The first Macedonian riders crashed against the Persian cavalry on the bank, swords and spears flashing in the fading light. The clash was sudden and brutal, hooves churning mud, blades ringing on bronze. On the left flank, Macedonian light infantry waded through waist-deep water to engage the archers, driving them back with a hail of javelins. The Persians fought fiercely, but the momentum was with Alexander's men. Within minutes, the enemy line began to break, riders wheeling away in retreat. Alexander pursued only far enough to secure the crossing, then called his men back to reform. The Persians, bloodied and scattered, withdrew toward the east, leaving the riverbank in Macedonian hands. As the sun dipped low, its light turned the water to gold. Alexander rode along the bank, his armor gleaming, speaking to his drenched but victorious soldiers. "This," he told them, "is how we meet the Persians. Without fear, without delay. Remember today, for it is only the first step toward their fall." The men cheered, their voices carrying across the plains. The Granicus had been crossed in part, and soon it would be crossed in full. The night after the skirmish, the Macedonian army camped on the western bank of the Granicus River. Scouts confirmed that the full Persian force, cavalry, infantry, and mercenaries, had taken position along the far bank of Alexander's advance. The time for probing attacks was over. The next crossing would decide the battle. At dawn, a light mist rose from the river. Alexander donned his gleaming bronze cuirass inlaid with silver patterns, his crimson cloak pinned at the shoulder. He mounted Bucephalus and rode to the front of the companion cavalry. Behind them, the phalanx stood in deep ranks, their sarissas upright like a forest waiting to sweep forward. Parmenion again counseled caution. The river is swift, the bank steep, and they hold the high ground. Better to wait until they grow impatient and leave their post. Alexander shook his head. If we wait, their courage will grow. We cross now and break them before they know fear. At the signal, the cavalry surged into the river, followed closely by light infantry and the phalanx. Arrows rained down from Persian archers, striking shields and glancing off bronze helmets. Horses snorted and splashed through the current, muscles straining against the pull of the water. On the far bank, the Persian cavalry charged to meet them. The clash was thunderous, bronze against bronze, spear points shattering on shields, swords flashing in the morning sun. Alexander drove straight for the Persian left, his lance striking down a noble in ornate armor. Around him, the companion cavalry carved through the enemy line, forcing them to wheel and regroup. The phalanx, emerging from the water in disciplined formation, advanced relentlessly up the bank. Their sarissas pushed the Persian infantry back step by step, the long pikes punching through shields and armor. Greek mercenaries in Persian service fought fiercely, but their line buckled under the coordinated assault. In the center, Alexander spotted Mithridates, the son-in-law of King Darius, rallying his men. Spurring Bucephalus forward, Alexander drove his spear into Mithridates' chest, unhorsing him in a single blow. The sight of their commander falling shattered the morale of the Persian troops. Within an hour, the Persian force was in full retreat, scattering across the plains. Macedonian cavalry pursued just far enough to ensure they would not regroup, then returned to secure the field. Standing on the far bank, Alexander raised his sword high. "This river is no longer their defense," he told his men. "It is the path by which we enter their empire." The cheers of victory rolled across the water. The first great battle in Asia was won, and Alexander's legend had taken its next step. My friends, we have walked together through history's turning point. From the shores of Macedonia to the banks of the Granicus, across the windswept waters of the Hellespont, and into the heart of Asia. We have stood beside Alexander in council and in battle, witnessed his triumphs, his vows, and the birth of a campaign that would reshape the known world. Year of this journey would have been possible without you, the audience, joining me step by step. And your willingness to see the past not as dusty pages, but as living moments have given life to this story. As we close this chapter, I hope these scenes have stirred your imagination, that you could smell the sea air of Sestos, hear the clash of bronze at the Granicus, and feel the weight of destiny in each stride Alexander took. History belongs to all of us. By remembering it, by telling it, we keep the voices of the past alive. So, thank you for sailing these waters with me. Until our next journey, keep your eyes on the horizon, for the story always continues